Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
What I wanted to do, so NUI is basically a buzzword to try to get at least a half dozen of you here. But I've got a different expression for NUI probably than what a lot of the typical Microsoft view of what NUI is. And I'll go into that shortly. But what I wanted to talk about, so I basically am here en route to Nottingham. And so I really wanted to just drop by the lab, say hi to folks, tell you a little bit about what I'm up to, and also see if I could convince some of you to come down and hang out in our lab in Bangalore, because we're doing a lot of really cool stuff. And it's India, which is kind of a cool place to be. So this is a little slide just talking about our lab. This is the old lab, but it's got a cow in the picture. And I find it, I really am afraid of getting rid of it. Because I really like it. But yeah, we've been in the new lab now for 2 weeks.
When you get cows outside the new lab?
3 weeks. Not yet. And we're certainly not going to get one picturesque because the new lab is very, very busy. It's downtown. So, you know, I mean, it's a fairly traditional computer science lab in a lot of ways. There are 7 research areas. It's actually more now as of 3 days ago. But I don't have that up there.
Can I ask, what's the difference between software engineering and rigorous software engineering?
The idea behind rigorous software engineering is it's a lot of stuff that is formalized. So it's...
Oh, so
yes.
Formal methods?
Yes.
But they don't use the word rigorous.
Yeah. Anyway, the thing I want to talk about is this one here. And this is the most important of the groups, and it's the one that I manage. It's a technology for emerging markets group. So this is really what we do, and this is the point of our group. It's really 3 main ideas. The first is to understand the existing technology users and potential technology users in developing communities. So the first thing is just really get an understanding, a study of what people are doing and what they might be doing. The second is then to take that understanding, translate that into design for technologies that contribute to the socioeconomic development of these folks, and then importantly, extend that into evaluation of those designs. That is this word evaluate turns out to be really important in the business I'm in of information communication technologies for development. ICT4D is the initialism we use for it. And in that area, in that field, there's been a huge amount of hype of if we just throw a lot of technology at the problem of poverty, poverty goes away. If we just throw technology at education, the whole problem of education goes away. And it's just not true. And a lot of the problem is that many of the projects that have been initialized in that space have not then carried through to actually be doing appropriate evaluation of them. And so that's an important part of what we see our work as doing. And then the final piece is how do you take the things that we design and build and then translate those into scaled impact? And the way we do that is by collaborating with product groups, importantly, but also NGOs, the various development-focused organizations, governments, other folks in industry, et cetera, to be able to take anything that we build and be able to scale it out in an appropriate way. We're a very small group. We're not going to be able to do that ourselves. So this is the group as it stands now, and we're a very multidisciplinary group. It spans from Nimi, who is an anthropologist. Yes?
What happens if you come across things that would positively impact the socio-economic development of your target users, but would eat our revenue in the West?
We don't talk too loudly about it, but we try to do it. So far we haven't seen those things, but it's possible. Like, so the question was really what happens, sorry, the question was what happens if you identify something that advances the socioeconomic development of people that you're working with, but that also might then eat into the profits of the mothership of the corporation. And my answer is that we try not to trumpet that too loudly. But if it's appropriate, we'll explore it as fully as we can. It's certainly not going to be something that's going to transfer it into product. But you know, I mean, those are trade-offs that you hit all the time. And there actually may be cases where we believe it may eat into profits, but in the end it doesn't, for important reasons. And we can get into that later. So basically all this slide is trying to show is the idea of spanning, going from people to technology and back again. This should be nothing new to any of you guys, but we are a highly multidisciplinary group is the main point. It's spanning really from social science up into fairly hardcore technology. Bill T's got his PhD in programming languages and is a really talented computer scientist. And then Indrani Mehdi is a designer. She's getting her PhD hopefully by next year in design. And then Jonathan Donner is from the comm school at Stanford originally. And then, of course, Nimi is an anthropologist. So we have research sites all over. I won't go into this, but it's from India, ranging into Philippines, Middle East, Africa, South America, North America. We really try to do a lot of different places. So this is one way of slicing some of the projects that we do. There are a lot of ways you can think about it, but this is a way that sort of buckets that you could put us in. One of them is in education. Another is in finance and livelihood. Another is in healthcare, down the bottom right. And then there are two that are not really in those kinds of domains that are a little different. So there's mobile phones. That's not an application domain, but it's more an interaction modality or a technical modality. But it's very, very important in the domain we're working in. And then understanding users is, the idea there is that these are basic explorations of knowledge of how the people that we're trying to work with interact with technologies. And I can go into more about that later. Things like cognitive traits of low literate users, et cetera, that actually wind up influencing design quite a lot. But for the talk today, I thought I would talk about three things. The first is this pen-based interface for microfinance. Okay? The second is a broadcast system for an NGO that works with urban sex workers in Bangalore. And then the third is this voice portal for citizen journalism. Okay? So I thought I'd talk about those three as spanning a way of some of these ideas that we picture NUI and the way in which it's relevant for the populations we work with. So we'll start out with this project. This was headed by Aishwarya Ratan. She is happily an MIT TR-35. Do you guys know what the TR-35 is? This is, what's that?
Is it a Russian?
It is, but that's not what she was awarded. That would be really cool, though. This is the technology review. MIT has a technology review magazine, and they have an annual set of awards for people that are 35 or younger that are awesome technologists, basically.
Oh yeah, we get that. You have a few of those around here.
Yeah, so she won one this year, actually. So congratulations to her. The bad news for us is that she just left to go to Yale, so we lost her. But I'm talk about this project anyway. So this is the idea behind the project. What we want to know is, can handwritten pen and paper-based systems be used effectively to manipulate digital data? Okay? If you've spent any time in the developing world, you'll know that paper is an integral part of everything they do. You go into any Indian government office and there are piles of paper, literally, piles everywhere. Paper is not going to be going away anytime soon, and there are a lot of good reasons for this. But the problem is that paper also has a lot of downsides to it. And so we wanted to understand if we could use the workflow and work processes of pen and paper, but mitigate some of the problems associated with paper. So this is the domain we're working in. This is this area called self-help groups. Have you ever heard of self-help groups? So a few of you have. So the idea behind self-help groups, these are, in the case we're looking at here, they're almost always women. And they're groups of between maybe 10 and 20 women that get together, pool their resources, and they can work in a number of domains. Some of them are social, there's political. Economic is a very common one, where they'll pool their funds together, and this allows them to then open a bank account jointly with all their pooled resources. And the bank is willing to then lend to a group of women together because it's much more likely that they're going to be able to get back their money from this group of people that are all on the hook together. This also allows them to provide enough money to make it worth the bank's while. Because in general, these women are contributing only a few hundred rupees a week or something like that. It's about the equivalent of maybe a couple of dollars a week, which is very, very small for a bank to be able to deal with. So they're very large, and they're actually very successful. So the group we're working with is called Pradhan. Pradhan is a very large NGO that helps to manage some of these self-help groups. They're kind of an interim, a mediator between the self-help groups and the banks or other organizations. So what we're looking at is a system that uses what's called the computer Munchy. So here's what happens. Okay, so the self-help group happens here. The women get together. You can see here there's a cash box and a recording big book that includes all of the information for all the accounts. And a writer writes down what the current status of every woman in the group's account is. What they owe, how much they've paid in on that meeting, all that kind of information. This then goes into a carbon. The carbon is then folded up and taken off to this, it's the RMTS1 form. A copy is dropped in this drop box. Now, the drop box, then this fellow comes along on a motorbike, picks up the carbon, and takes it to a nearby town and drops it off where the computer Munchy lives. The computer Munchy is a guy who's been hired by the NGO to handle all of the paperwork for usually about 100 or so of these self-help groups from all these surrounding villages. He enters in this information into Excel or into Tally or some other kind of software device or software program, and then does any corrections necessary, prints out a secondary copy of information that's sort of what is going on to the bank, and then drops it off in another box. The dude on the bike grabs it, takes it back to the meeting, and the cycle happens again. Now this is when things work well. You can see it takes a little over a week, or about a week, to take place. During monsoon or other times of weather problems, this can be 2 or 3 weeks for this process to take place because the roads are impassable. So the biker can't actually get from the village to the nearby town. So that's a problem in itself, right? That you've got this big delay between what the women are seeing and what the computer Munchy is able to get on to the bank. But here's the other problem. So this is the form that the computer Munchy sees, and you're filling this out. What do you fill in to the Excel sheets? I mean, the simple truth is that he doesn't fill in anything. He says, I can't read this, sends back a form to the women and says, I don't know what you're trying to write here, please fill this out. Make it clearer. Or another common problem is that the forms that he gets are not even filled out completely, so you have incomplete forms, so he has to manage that. So this is what we're trying to solve, is an issue of inaccuracy, incompleteness, and this inefficiency of this massive loop happening. Because once this happens, then you're looking at up to 6 weeks before a full cycle has happened. And in that time, you've got all kinds of fines and extra fees, issues that are dropped within accounts, et cetera, et cetera. So here's what we did. This is a prototype device. It uses an inductive scanner, which is what is underneath the platform here, and it uses an active pen. So this is a plain, normal ink pen with a little inductive coil around it. Works basically the same as like a tablet computer does as well. It's the same basic technology. But the difference is that you're filling out in ink a form that looks like this. This form is almost identical to the form that the women are currently using in their meetings. There are a few key differences. But what you do is you take this form, you touch it up in the corner. That does a register so that we know what the XY coordinates of the form is, get everything made. And then you just fill out all the information you need. And it's simultaneously digitized. And you can see that here. So as you fill in a given thing here, it will show up in the appropriate field. The little sound is so that you can play any given thing that you've entered into it to hear it. All right, so there's one other piece which is kind of interesting in the form, which we had to innovate on, which is this little black spot. This black spot is actually a backspace. And so the question is, once you've entered in some information in here, if it's incorrect as you've entered it, how do you correct it, change it? And so you need to have some way of backspacing. So that's of undo, yeah. And that's what that is, of clearing. So here's what happens. So handwritten numbers on the paper are entered. You'll notice that this book is actually fairly thick. You can include fairly thick bits of book on this thing. The scanner worked quite well. At the same time, the stuff is entered. It's digitized. And that information is then processed against an internal database so that we can detect things like accuracy or other kinds of problems. We can calculate what the current values are for everybody that's appropriate. And then an important other element is that you can see this cable leads to a little speaker so that information is then read out in an audio format for all of the people.
So a number 1, 2, 3 would be pressed, especially convert that into 1, 2, 3.
Yes, in Bangla or Orissa or whatever it is.
So it's not, you don't have to make sound notes, it will transform alphanumerics.
Yes, yes. And in fact, I'll get to it in a moment, but at the end of every sequence, so we actually force in the workflow that at the end of every person or every time you finished up a given set of people that you're working with, it actually forces a readout of all the current status of every single member of the self-help group. That turns out to be really important, and I'll explain why in just a couple of minutes. So we did a test. This was a field trial. This was comparing the normal book that they've been using, our little system, prototype system, and a touchscreen only. Now, basically, all we did here was we just took this touchscreen and didn't include any of this stuff. But the idea was that this would be similar to what you might do with a phone. And the notion here is, well, why bother with all this prototypey stuff? If we can just use a low-cost phone in the mix, then that should just be fine. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but bottom line is accuracy goes up, completeness goes up, efficiency goes up, everything's awesome, our system works great. But one detail in this that you should look at is the comparison between the slate and the touchscreen only. And you'll see that they're actually pretty similar. In fact, they're statistically the same. So that says, well, why not just use a touchscreen? Why bother with the slate itself? And this comes in with a lot of the survey responses and with a lot of our observations of talking with the women in the groups. The first is, notice this piece up at the top, which is, I like that the machine is speaking. We're illiterate people. We don't know what goes on, but when it speaks, we can know. This is actually an important element that we saw when we introduced this into the groups that we were working with. It was like a light that went on with a lot of the people we were working with. They have a lot of trust in the writer, but often the writer is not even a member of their group. It's someone that they've hired to be able to write for them. So this gives them a sense of ownership and control that they didn't have before, that tells them a little bit more about, I know exactly what's been entered into this system. And it's what I think it is, and I'm pretty sure that that's going to go on. The second piece is this here, which is we must have kata, the paper form. We're working in areas that are very harsh. Stuff breaks all the time. And the paper gives a sense of permanence to this data and this information. And so by having the paper there, they know that even with this ethereal nonsense of the data going off into the blue, they still have the data. They know what the numbers are, and they can get back to it. That sense of permanence is really important for them. And then finally is from the user. This is the writer saying, you know, I can use a calculator. I've used other people's mobile phones. I know how to do that. But writing by hand is habit. I feel it's better. And this gets to this notion of a natural user interface, something that is basically the same thing they've been doing for a long time. This is what they're used to. This is their expectation. And by migrating them into the system, into this system, it's actually a seamless migration. It's exactly what they've been doing for all this time before. So I'm going to transition there. Do you have any questions about this system first? Yes?
Yes, quick one. So I'm wondering if, like, over time, that equality of usualness with paper will go away as more and more people are doing more and more with their phones.
It's a good question. So the question is whether over time the equality or the sense of familiarity, I guess, is what you're asking about. So the familiarity definitely will. We've got evidence that, in fact, people get used to very quickly other modes of entry. And that's not such a big deal. The paper, the sense of permanence for the paper doesn't go away. And that means you have to have some form of printer or something else, which can actually be quite expensive in a lot of these domains. And so it's an interesting question. And it's not clear to us yet whether or not we can get that with the phones.
Hitherto, they've used paper, but it's not printed output.
So say again?
Hitherto, they've been using paper.
Yes.
But it didn't look like printed output.
No. What I meant was if you're just using a phone entry,
Yeah.
then you need a printer as well. You need some kind of permanent evidence of what you're doing, the transaction.
I think she's right. And I've also, the book I wrote with Method Paper Solvers, the chapter 4, and the opening example is precisely the same example. It's the why police use paper. And the reason why we use paper at point of entry is because it has both a permanent and a temporary facticity, which is distinct from the copies of it, the data once it's entered into the file system. And I think that's a stronger argument than the one you put, which Helena quite rightly picked up on, that actually the status of it as a file type, if you want to think, is different and it's unique. It's permanent, it's visible, it's inviolate. That's, I think, a stronger way of doing what is natural.
I agree.
Yeah.
But in terms of the notion of can they get used to the entry? So from purely this point of this habit bit, habits can change. And we have evidence for that. But your point, I think, goes beyond that, not beyond the notions of habit. Yeah. But the habit piece is actually important, like the notion of how effective people get and how quickly they adapt to another mode of entry. We have evidence from another project where we're trying to use this system now that they're using a mobile phone entry. And in the training, they hate it. They really don't like the mobile phone at all. But by the end of a few weeks of using it, they're incredibly fluent. and actually they prefer the mobile phone to ours.
Well, it depends what work's being done. So a property of paper is, as I said, it can be permanent, it must be temporary, so it can be destroyed easily, but it can be not destroyed. But also it can make the data entry more visible.
Yeah, for the women who are using the system and prefer the phone, they don't really care. They're just trying to get paid. And so they don't have a lot of investment in the information once it's been recorded. And so from their perspective,
So getting it right is the only issue.
getting it right and hassle and that kind of stuff. And if it's involved in a phone that's small, that they can use easily and they can carry it around, then that's okay.
And when these are found, does it have an auditory playback of the tape?
So this is a different domain. This is in healthcare gathering information domain. And I don't think it does, but these women are also a little more educated. So they are actually all literate, these women using the phone. These are not. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, we'll keep going. So the next project I want to talk about, so I want to move from paper into voice. And this is actually a very important area for people in the developing world. And I'll go into reasons for that, but there's a lot of things going on there. So first off, let's think about the phone. Okay, internet penetration is about 7% in 2010. In many states, it's dramatically less than that. The state of Chhattisgarh, which is a project I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, it's down below 1%. So we have very, very low internet penetration rates. And there are a lot of reasons for it. You've got power, education, financial resources. You've got all these kinds of issues. But in contrast, mobile penetration is extremely high. This number is actually too low. It's up closer to 70% now in India. You've got cheap instruments. They're really cheap call rates, and it's all voice. So issues like literacy don't matter so much, language doesn't matter so much, and the expense really matters a lot. So the first project I'm going to talk about that worries about this is an ethnographic action research project that I did with Nitya Sambasivan, very talented PhD student at UC Irvine, who came out, and she wanted to work with, she's been working a lot with notions of sharing and technology sharing among groups. We wanted to look at this group of urban sex workers in Bangalore for a few reasons. One was to use that group as a lens for design into all kinds of really difficult to reach groups that are very, have a lot of issues in common. They're wary, they're often exploited in different ways, they're migratory. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But so we've been talking to this Pragati, which is an NGO that works with urban sex workers. The reason why they work with them originally was mostly as in AIDS prevention. But it turned out that as they were working with them more and more, they realized that if all they did was target AIDS prevention, that the women were not really interested in interacting with them. They had many, many more needs. It was much richer, much broader spectrum. So they started applying to these other needs to try to reach out to the women. So what we built was a broadcast system for their mobile phones. So why? Well, first off, NGOs want to communicate with the people they're trying to work with. And there are a lot of reasons for wanting to do this. You have announcements, you've got reminders, emergency services, all the kinds of things that you would want to do for an NGO like this. But the problem is that it's really hard to reach all the members because they are nomadic, they're illiterate, you can't use flyers. There are a lot of really serious privacy concerns because the women don't want to be known necessarily. They have a lot of schedule dependencies. I'll talk about that in a minute. So there are a lot of issues there. And the other thing is that phones are almost ubiquitous. In fact, among urban sex workers, it's almost 100%. And if you think about it, there's a good reason for that, because the phones are actually necessary for them to do their jobs. And so these women all have phones. And this is not true for women in the same economic bracket. So these are some of the design issues that we ran into when we tried to build this broadcast system. First is the notion that many of the women have multiple identities, and you have to worry about that. They lead double lives because many of the women have families back at home that don't actually know that they're doing the sex work as their main job. So they just believe their husbands and kids, et cetera, just believe they're off doing domestic work, et cetera. They have multiple devices, so they'll use multiple SIM cards, they'll use dual SIM card phones, they'll use multiple phones to be able to manage this kind of juggling practice. And there are a lot of timing issues because different women work at different times. And it's actually really bad if you interrupt them at the wrong time. Either their phone is switched off, in which case you're not going to reach them, or you're going to reach them at a bad time, which is potentially quite dangerous. So these are the basic design principles that we had. What we built was really brain dead simple. It was a very basic robocalling system with some automatic stuff built into it, some scripting that was unique for each person. I'll get into a lot of this, but basically one of the really important things was leveraging the institutional trust and finding a good time to call. And so this was, from a technical point of view, these were some of the really interesting issues, but there wasn't a lot there. So when we deployed, this is what we did. First thing was a pilot. This was about an N of 35. We had a microfinance loan reminders. Now the issue here is that a number of women, so the NGO we were working with handled their own microfinance loan system for a lot of these women. And the problem was these women would forget to pay their loans because there were all these different times of the month whenever their payments were due. And so the NGO had asked us, well, is there a way that you can actually remind them to pay this because it's costing them money? It's important that way. So we included that. HIV testing, this was a much larger calling of people because this is also broadcast among many of the people that they're working with. And then a computer training session announcement. This one was interesting because there was no other mechanism for calling other than what we were doing. So this was sort of our main test to see, is this effective at all in getting into the people. These were the deployment methods. It was really interviews, data recording, phone logs, a lot of those kinds of things. So findings. One of the interesting things was that when the women would receive our calls, they were really curious about the calls, and they also were wondering what the hell is really going on here. The call was coming from Microsoft, but the interesting thing was rather than calling Microsoft back on their phone, they would immediately call Pragati, the NGO. And that was an interesting thing there, because basically what they did was that they called Pragati and said, I just got this call from Geeta Madam. Is this legit? Or, this is very interesting. Can you tell me more about it? And so one of the things that this did for the NGO, which was very positive, was it also brought a tighter relationship between the clientele group they had and them. This was actually a very, very common thing. This one surprised us a bit. Almost all the women listened to every message all the way through. And I don't know how you guys treat robocalls when you receive them, but we expected this to drop off really fast, and it didn't. Overall, the women listened to everything all the way through. The only case where they didn't so much was in the STI testing notification. And part of the reason there is because they get this all the time, and they're kind of sick of hearing about it. It's like, get your STI test, get your STI test, yes. And so they weren't so interested. We only had about maybe 70% of the women listen all the way through to that one. It was also a longer, it was like a 45-second message. So that's that. One of the really interesting things we found was that anchoring with the NGO, by using the head of the NGO we were working with as the voice to talk to the women, turned out to be extremely important. When we were first designing this, we thought we were just gonna hire a Bollywood star to do this for us, because we thought that'd be really cool, the women would dig that, etc. No, that could have been the worst possible thing we could have done, as it turns out. We didn't do it actually because we kind of ran out of time. But as we talked to the women later, they told us that would have been a really bad thing. Because by having Geeta talk to them on the phone, that to them was their sense of assurance that this was all legit, that this was a real thing for them, that they were really interested in. And so yeah, here, if not for the voice of Geeta Madam, I would not be sure. We know her, respect her. If it were someone else, I would really suspicious. I took the message seriously only because of Madam. So that turned out to be very important for us. So I'm going to kind of leave this for a moment, but I wanted to bring this in because it's a very simple system that had some really interesting design issues that we wouldn't have come across before, that also opens up what I think are an interesting set of people who can use technologies who currently, information technology, who currently are using very little. But because the mobile is penetrating almost everywhere, we can start to look at the ways in which all these different classes of people can be using them. And they're not going to be using them like we use smartphones. So that, yes?
How have you not done that? How have you not just done an Outlook reminder with a genteel voice of Geeta Madam? How's it different from that?
It's not an Outlook reminder.
No, intently it's not an Outlook reminder. Persuade me that what you've done is not devise a reminder system over mobile networks, which is an analog for many sorts of office-based reminder systems.
Mostly because, so I think the way it's more than reminders, so in at least one of the cases it was, in the MFI case, it's just a reminder system. But the thing that the NGO wanted it for was as a general announcement or connectivity of being able, so they often have an interaction with some of these women only occasionally. And this was a way of bringing that relationship much more closely. Because the only way right now that they can connect with their clientele is through word of mouth on the street. So they have to go out and fan out and talk to these people in general. This is a way of using technology to bring them closer to the NGO. And that's very different from just an Outlook reminder system, which assumes that the women are there no matter what to listen like part of the NGO and are really interested in it and are going to be seeking it out. In general, they're not. So that's my main argument there. It's not quite the same. But from a technical point of view,
basically what you're arguing is that the reminders end up to be reminders, call me, call me, call me. And the me is the person who gets the value out of it.
it is a call me.
That is the NGO's value, is this reminder system provokes their clients to call them.
It provokes their clients to think of them and to come in and interact with them. The calling is actually not so relevant. Like that happened there. But the main point is that the clients actually come back and are interacting and consuming the services. The more relationship they have with them, the better off they're able to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is providing these various aids and other kinds of services. One interesting thing about this is that this system, this basic idea of a calling system that's very low cost that anybody can use, is rabidly popular, the idea. Right now, it's very hard to execute. And we're actually trying to build, in our group, a very simple, turnkey, easy to deploy stack that will allow you to build something like this. Right now, this thing here was held together with duct tape and baling wire and a Linux stack. And it was really difficult to keep running. And any organization who wants to do this needs an IT staff to do it. And so one of the things that we got out of this was actually to be able to build something that anybody can just buy, like either a Windows phone. Our first idea was to do this all based on Windows Phone. Turns out that that's going to be kind of hard because of the platform. But instead, we can just do this on a simple netbook and a cheap phone, like a Nokia or something like that. We can talk more about that later, but anyway. Next. All right, so we're back to phones now. Yeah, I've got a few minutes. So what this slide is really showing is that when you start to look in the developing world, the world of smartphones is really not important. It's just almost not relevant. It's becoming more relevant because now you can have $80 smartphones. Android phones are showing up in a lot of places. But in India right now, it's less than 5% of the market. All of this makes up the rest of it. And these are basically like J2ME phones or very, very basic phones where the supplemental features are maybe a torch or a radio. And that's it. This is not going to go away. Even with the $80 smartphones, you're still going to have a massive quantity of these things. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of phones spread out through these spaces. Text interfaces are problematic. You've got, in India, 26% non-literacy rate. So it's extremely high. And in India also, you've got massive numbers of languages. The Indian constitution is translated into something like 25 languages. I think that may be incorrect, but it's something on that order. And there are many more than that, beyond that. So how do you handle all this diversity? Well, so to look at this, we built a system. It's called CGNet Suara. And the idea here is to use the phone as a citizen journalism type system, okay? So this is work of Bill Tees in our group with CGNet, MIT, and the International Center for Journalists. The basic idea in the system is that you call up the system and you leave a story, some kind of story of stuff that's going on that's relevant in your community. And then anybody can call up the number and listen to all the stories. So effectively, it's like an audio phone-based wiki in which everybody sets things up. Now, it's set up for citizen journalism with a couple of key elements. First, all the submissions are reviewed by a moderator over the web. Okay? Now, the reason why that's important is because you get a lot of random stuff coming through. A fairly common kind of submission is breathing because people aren't used to leaving messages. Another common kind of message is singing. I don't know exactly why, but they love to sing songs on the system. So you kind of want to keep that down a little bit. And so the editor will take those things, the moderator will look through those, filter them out, take the ones that are legitimate stories, and then post them. Now they're posted in three basic ways. The first is for playback on the audio channel. All messages are posted for that, so you can hear them on the phone. They're also all posted on the web, so you can listen to any of these messages on the web. And I'll explain why that's important in a moment. And then finally, some of the submissions are transcribed and are written out for posting on the CGNet site and another list that goes with it. Now, these are generally more important stories as perceived by the editors. So why do we want to do this? I'm going to show you a nice little chart here. This is three fairly large languages in Chhattisgarh, this state that we're working in. And you can see that we've got, 2.75 million speakers of Gondi, 1.75 of Kuruk, about 1 million of Kui. There are millions and millions of people speaking these languages, okay? And they speak only these languages. Now I want you to look at the green bars, which is the number of news outlets either print or audiovisual, that are in any of these languages. It's 0. So there are no news outlets at all in any of these languages. Now, there are a few reasons for this. One is because the tribal journalists who actually know these languages don't report in these languages. Well, usually, if they're a journalist, they also know Hindi, and the only jobs are for Hindi, so they're going to go and report in Hindi. And so there's really no print or audiovisual for the journalists to even report. They go off to the city, et cetera. They're not going to be local. And the second reason is because in India, it's not legal to broadcast news over community radio. So community radio is becoming a very popular way of dealing with news in the developing world. But in India, there's a big concern about various kinds of propaganda from, Naxal, Maoist, other kinds of leftist or other organizations. So they basically just prevent it. So news can only be reported by the government. So this gives us a big problem. If all of these cases, the news is, well, basically you just have these people without access to their own news. So when they use our system, we've had this system intact for about 1.5 years now, I think, and it's actually become very popular. We've had many thousands of people calling into the system. About 40% of all the concerns just have to do with governance. So basically, it's people bitching about crappy governance. So it's like, the employment scheme workers aren't getting paid. You've got issues with forest land distributions, corruption going on. One of the early really interesting successes that we had in the system was this here, that there were a large number of teachers who were not being paid. And they reported the system on CGNet, and within a couple of weeks, they were paid. So basically, you bump it up, somebody hears about it, and action gets taken place. But it's not all just complaining about governance. There are other really interesting news that comes out of this kind of thing. One of them is pollution and public health emergencies. So you have a diarrhea outbreak, something like that going on, it gets reported. You have some problems with well water, arsenic in the well, those kinds of things. Those things get reported. And then finally, the tribal stories and songs. There are so many people singing on these things that we kind of let through at least a chunk of these. And people really love it. And so far be it for us to actually decide not to. What's that?
Why are you so averse to them? I mean, it's sure the lesson with social networking in the West is that virtuous content.
It's really, that's the thing, is I think originally we just said we just want important news. And the truth is that they want to do a lot of other kinds of stuff. And so you let them. I think it is, sort of our propriety of, of classic development, of you just want virtuous content out there. And, the simple truth is people like entertainment. You look at any tabloid and the bulk of it is just, crap about entertainers. And so, fine. Yes?
Yeah, so some people in South Africa did a similar type of work because they use mobile phones and they had a message board in a hut somewhere, amongst the villages around that everyone has mobile phones. And they could upload things to this message board with Bluetooth, and then people could come and take stuff away.
Yes.
And guess what? The most popular thing that was uploaded, it was the gospel choirs, and they were having competitions about who's sounding which way.
Yeah, so I mean, it makes sense when you stop and think about it for a moment. And I think what we want in CGNet is to not let that completely dominate. But you can't ignore it.
It's something to do with the level of literacy, perhaps, and verbal things.
I don't think so. I really don't. I mean, again, if you just look at the news, I mean, the bulk of the news that we consume in Europe and in North America, the bulk of it is crap. I mean, the vast majority of it is about entertainment. It's about, Britney Spears. It's about, like all of the stuff that it's
It could be.
our equivalent of gospel choirs.
It could be that what you have here is better not thought of as a news channel, but as a novel social network system.
Yes.
So Gary's system, which we've
Big board, yeah?
Yeah, he was concerned because he sought virtue, but actually people wanted to share their lives. That's their news, and they share their lives by songs and Bible class, things that fill their own lives up. There could be a space for official news, but actually what he built was a social networking system, and he didn't want that. He wanted something which would be politically enabling. Well, actually, this is the problem with personal life, is celebrating oneself with songs. And maybe what you've done here is actually invented something, and you're not seeing it, which is, this is a social networking system for people who don't have a technology for it because of their language specificity.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, that's a whole other way that some of this work is going towards. This particular work has another political underpinning, which is it's all by these journalists. And so the journalists are really interested in the notion of journalism and of citizen journalism and how that can be worked from the bottom up through these communities. And so, I mean, they have very clear motivations of what they're expecting. I think we can. And it's something that we're really interested in. And I can follow up more with you on that because I think it's an important question. It's something we would like to do. Right now, it's not like most of these folks have access to Facebook. They have phones.
Yeah, and tell the stories of songs at UGC, right? You said that's
Yeah.
UGC,
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to share this last story. This one happened a little while ago. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because it talks a little bit about the reach of the system beyond just this community. Okay, so it's a fairly tragic story. And basically it's about this fellow who, the NREGA is a scheme in India where the government guarantees anyone who wants it to do 100 days of unskilled labor and get paid for it. Okay? So anyone who is unemployed or whatever, they can get this kind of deal. The guy did his 100 days of work, can't get paid, and his son is really sick in hospital. So he's trying to get his money so that he can pay for additional treatment for his kid. And he's going from fellow to fellow to try to get this money. Can't get it. While he's out wandering around trying to get his money, his son dies. Okay? So this is the story that was reported. A few days after this was reported, it shows up on the BBC Hindi site. A couple of days later, it shows up on the Hindu, and then on the Times of India. These dailies are reaching hundreds of millions of people. They're really huge readerships. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it shows an example of how this incredibly local story is able to have a reach that goes way beyond them once they have a voice. And this becomes actually a lot of the value to the folks who are using it, is this sense that I have some agency to be able to talk about my issues and that the rest of the world pays attention. And indeed, one of the things we found is that all of the big news sites are trolling CGNet, the CGNet site, to basically get information because this stuff is coming up. It's being mediated by one of their own, by a real journalist, and so they kind of trust it. And they're actually taking it and then printing it in the mainstream news. And we see that as a really interesting evolution of the system. I don't think we quite expected it to be quite this successful. But this is not that unusual now. So, and this is also the reason why this web-based information is important. It's not for the people themselves because they don't have access to the web. It's for the outside world to read what they're doing. All right, so there are a lot of research challenges associated with this. One of them is issues of scale. I mean, how well can this kind of thing scale if every single message has to be monitored by a single person or even a team of people? IVR systems are a pain in the butt for us to use. And if you have very little interaction with technologies, they're really painful. And the deeper you make them, the bigger kinds of trees you have, the harder they are to use. How do you deal with categorization, searching, browsing for all this kind of content? You've got multiple languages, it's all audio. How do you deal with all that? So that leads into this, that there's a lot of really interesting research here for speech researchers. It's issues of language-independent audio indexing, classification, speech reco and indic languages. There's very little work done here, surprisingly. And then finally is this idea of a social ecosystem. Credibility of reports becomes really important, especially for news. I think for just social kinds of stuff, it's not as important, but it becomes much more important if you're getting into news space. And this idea of protecting reporter identity is very important as well. These are areas that it actually can be quite dangerous to report, to speak truth to power, because you're going to get killed. And if it gets back that you're the one mouthing about this governor who's not doing what he's supposed to do, how do you protect folks against that? And then finally, this notion of managing conflict, if it becomes a full social kinds of system, you kind of want to, people are going to start fighting and bickering. And you want to make sure that you can keep that from spiraling out of control and manage that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's all I had to talk about. I went a little bit over time, and I apologize. But any questions or thoughts? Thank you.